Good morning. I want to welcome everybody to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us. Today, we're going to continue our discussion in the Daodejing, starting with chapter 19 now. I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. All right. So in this one, we're going to just kind of jump into it, and we'll talk about some of this as we kind of go through it, and then there'll be a little bit more of a reflection that we're going to be doing a bit later here, so get ready for that. But very much like what we had in chapter 18, where we were going through a number of things that they were saying were kind of like these devolutions from having fully embraced or being in participation with the Tao, how things kind of degenerated into these different states. So here we kind of pick up on that same theme. These two chapters really go well together and probably should be read together. But we have kind of this idea then of renouncing some of these items that were brought up in the previous chapter. So here we have, starting, give up sainthood, renounce wisdom, and it will be 100 times better for everyone. This is kind of an interesting line. Now, again, with these translations into English, we always run into some interesting challenges with consistency. So we don't always notice that they're the same words that are being used. But the word here for sainthood is actually the same thing that we've been seeing for sage, but there is one big difference in the sense that there is not a the word for person connected with it. So everywhere else that we have where it's talking about this idea of sage, it's kind of a combination word that is identifying it. So here it's bringing up this idea of sacred or holy, or what's being translated here as sainthood. But the difference is that the without having the person connected to it, it's not having the same implication as the rest of what's being talked about in the Daodejing. So even though it sounds like it's a contradiction, where normally they're talking about the sage, and here it's saying give up, essentially the same word, or at least part of the same word here, sainthood, it's not talking about the idea of the sage within the Daodejing in general, but this idea that I think they're trying to bring out in this translation of sainthood, or some of the translations will have the sacred or the holy. And this would be a concept that's more of a separated idea. So with the sage within Taoism, it's more about this idea of the person who's gaining understanding about working in harmony with the Tao, whereas this idea of sainthood or holiness or sacredness falls into this category of kind of separate, of this is somebody who's above and beyond, or a concept that is separate from the rest of reality. And I don't think they would really go in that direction. So here they're saying this idea of the separateness or something being set apart, and the same thing with when they're talking about wisdom. Clearly what they've been referring to all along is this idea of humanly derived wisdom. So we have the same kinds of stuff that was being talked about in the last chapter being brought up here, saying, hey, this idea of identifying special people or special places and times, or this idea that there's special wisdom that you have to have, we need to let go of that. And if we do, the implication they're saying is it's going to be 100 times better for everyone. This whole idea of the hierarchy that's being created, or that's being suggested by the dominant culture, is where they would say, again, this conflict comes into play. Because when you create these artificial divisions, you're inviting then this idea of competition. You're inviting this idea of, a hierarchy in terms of ranking who people are in relationship to each other. And they would say that this is actually part of what the major problem is with what's happening in the world at that time. Again, referring back to the beginnings of the Warring States period, where there's a great deal of conflict in early China. And so it continues, if I can get the keyboard to work. Give up kindness, renounce morality, and people will rediscover filial piety and love. So here again, kindness, key term that's come up several times. That's definitely in reference to the one of the key words for Confucianism. Morality, interesting translation of this word that sometimes is translated as ritual, or sometimes as righteousness, or sometimes as justice. A couple of different ways that it goes, that is translated, but I think it kind of brings out the right idea here in how we've talked about morality, that this idea that there's these value judgments about good and evil and how do these play out, they would argue are, again, things that human constructs are being brought into our perception of reality, and that we need to recognize that these are in some sense arbitrary, that they've been added. And so if we want to get at being able to see clearly, we need to be able to remove some of these filters from our presence so that we can see more directly what's going on. And again, the kindness, we can kind of think of through this back to what we were looking at in chapter 5, where it was saying that heaven and earth are not kind. One of the interesting aspects of where this seemed to be coming from had to do with, and this happens also in some of the different English translations, that kindness is coming from the concept for kindred. So kindness has a little bit to do historically with this idea of respect, in a sense, or obligation within one's kin group. And one of the points that we're looking into in chapter 5 was that there may have been this idea that there's like ruling classes or ruling families that were expected to have respect or adoration shown to, and that was what was being rejected. Not this idea of how do we be kind to one another, but more this idea that there's a prescribed way that we're supposed to be to one another, that according to the Confucius, if everybody would just pay attention to their place in society and demonstrate their ability to have deference for those above, and people below would act the way that they're supposed to act, then everything would fall into order. So again, this idea of that prescribed way of being kind, or holding that up as one of the ideals, along with this idea of morality or justice, that those things, again, because of their artificial nature, are part of what's creating the problem. Get rid of those things and people will rediscover filial piety, this idea of the natural affection between people, in particular within families. Then he says, give up ingenuity and renounce profit, and bandits and thieves will disappear. So we might have a lot of questions about this, but the idea is, we saw before, if you amass so much jade in your hall that you have a hard time locking it up, you're going to have a hard time protecting it from people wanting to steal it. You create that value of rare materials or things that are hard to come by, and it just invites this whole way of looking at things where there's this inequality that starts to emerge. And so they would argue again that this is something that we are imposing on the system, something that we are bringing to this way of organizing ourselves that is having a consequence of people not having enough. And as a consequence, there is this issue of bandits and thieves, or we could look at it in terms of the division between, or just simply the envy that gets created. So we've got class separation issues that can result in unequal or inappropriate divisions of material goods, as well as the idea of greed that can come into play, or envy. So he says these three things are outward forms alone. So this would be some things that we can start to take advantage of, maybe in terms of, let's say, public policy, right? Or ways we can redesign how things are done. But he continues and says they're not sufficient in themselves. Something else that's still needed. He says it's more important to see the simplicity, to realize our true nature, to cast off selfishness and temper desire. Now, this is our Feng and English translation. I think it's pronounced Feng, actually. I'm not sure. But the interesting thing about how he's translating this part is that he breaks it into essentially kind of four pieces.
Feng and English.
Feng?
Feng and English. I'm making a pun.
Ah.
English, I like that.
So in this last part, we see it kind of broken into essentially kind of four parts: to see simplicity, to realize true nature, to cast off selfishness, and you could add in the two here too, and to temper desire. So boom, 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 these four things. But I think there's something a little bit different going on here. And it's not brought out super well in this particular translation, but when it says to see simplicity, he's referring to this idea of observing raw silk. And when he says to realize our true nature, it's actually this more literally to hold on to uncarved wood. So this translation is trying to take those concepts. Okay, what are we saying when we're talking about behold undyed wool or raw, excuse me, not wool, but raw silk? They're suggesting that the implication of that is to see the simplicity. And the same thing with, well, what about handling raw wood or wood that's not been carved? Well, they're taking the route that this is to realize our true nature. But I don't know if that's exactly right. I think that more what's happening here is that these two aspects of beholding the raw silk and to handle uncarved wood are really meant more as an exercise that then is going to lead to the conclusion of what do we do with this idea of ourselves at the center of everything, kind of the natural situation we find ourselves in as humans, where our perception is always from our location, right? It just by the nature of the way we see the world, we see ourselves at the center of it. And it can lead to this idea of self-centeredness, or in this case, selfishness. So how do we wrestle with that to recognize, a perspective beyond our personal perspective that puts us into a different way of viewing ourselves and others and our relationship to them? And then with that, this idea of tempering desire. So I'm going to pull in a translation here from Ellen Chen that I think brings this out a little bit better. She says, look to the undyed silk. Okay, so here's this idea. It's something that we're supposed to kind of undertake. Hold on to the uncarved wood. So I want to take a little bit of time with this session for us to actually do that. We're not going to be able to hold on to the uncarved wood, but we're going to look at it and observe it and take some time to kind of think through the implications of this. What do they mean by that? How is looking at undyed silk or raw silk or holding on to uncarved wood, how is that supposed to help us? And we're going to take a little bit of time to kind of reflect on that. First, we'll look at raw silk. Does anybody know what this is?
Looks like a cocoon of a silkworm or something.
Exactly. So silk is this essentially a thread that the silkworm emits to create the cocoon for, to go through its transformation. I believe it's into more of a moth than a butterfly. but it's evidently all one string or one thread, which is fascinating. And it's very long. I think they said something like 100 meters, which I'm not sure what that translates into feet. But, here we have this this casing that's used in a particular way in nature that we are using very differently when we think about silk clothing. So if we're going to take some time to just think about what this is in terms of what we're looking at here, and try and figure out what the Taoists are hoping for us to realize by spending some time reflecting on this. How is that supposed to help us in terms of reorienting ourselves in the world along the lines that the Taoists would want to have us do? So we're just going to take a few minutes here and just kind of contemplate that to yourself, and then we'll come back and see what kind of insights people had for this. And if you're watching this as the video, you might want to go ahead and pause the video at this point. All right. Anybody have some observations they'd like to share about this?
These are observations on seeing the true nature of things and one's own true nature, the unspun silk and the uncovered block.
Well, in particular with silk, the question is, what do you suppose the Taoists are trying to help us to realize by reflecting specifically on raw silk?
Well, I have a conception of both of these images. It's kind of parallel.
Okay, we are going to talk about the wood in just a moment, but that's fine if you want to combine them at this point too. But I would like people to maybe have a chance to think through the wood part before we start giving ideas about the wood. So if you don't mind.
Well, with regard to original perception and original natures, kind of, I think of it. Original perception is there is neurologically speaking, the brain takes in all this sense data, which on a fine grain level is just a bunch of electrical chemical impulses from sense receptors. But ultimately it's this kind of raw data that the brain receives and assembles into a model of reality of whatever we're looking at, smelling, hearing, touching, but primarily sight. And so I've had a few experiences in my life of sort of direct perception, what I imagine the world must look like to a baby, where a baby hasn't learned to make out different objects and individuals and things, and it's all just lights and sounds and everything, undifferentiated awareness or perception, before we or maybe more I could say undifferentiated sensory awareness before we differentiate it into perception.
Yeah. So with the raw silk, then, are you making the kind of analogy that
to me, raw silk is an analogy for undifferentiated pre-perceptual awareness.
Okay. You made me think of something kind of interesting with your thought there too, about how we take in raw data in terms of like these electrical impulses, and then we construct something in our minds in terms of the actual perception. And it made me think about, the use of silk that's being used, right, is we're taking this thing and we're transforming it into something else. Your description about the raw data coming in and being transformed in our heads was kind of interesting, parallel in that respect. And then you've got the question about, the accuracy of how that's being assembled in our brain, and we could maybe look at that in terms of how do we attributing the value of the silk that's being transformed through the human ingenuity. So very interesting observation there. Anybody else?
I think we can,
Hmm.
yeah, I think kind of vaguely along the same lines. I think we do this a lot, like in everyday life. If we take something maybe that we're worried about and we kind of spin it and do all these different possibilities that stress us out. And we don't necessarily need to do that. We can just take it as it is and not make ourselves stress out so much.
Right, we get wound up.
Yes, exactly, yes.
Dwayne, do you have
I
any?
think if we just leave
Oh.
it simple, we'd be a lot more calm.
Yeah, Dwayne, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think for this exercise, I kind of focused on why do we pick this apart from everything else that's around it? Like, what is it that's making us differentiate the silk from the tree or from the leaf or other things? So mainly, like, what is drawing our attention to this, and like what draws others' attention to it to actually turn it into something that we use for textiles, or we kind of manipulate it.
Yeah. Anybody have any reflections on what the purpose of the cocoon is for and how that might have some input?
First, I was kind of thinking of that and how we take something that acts as like a protection for the worm, we treat as something very delicate.
That's another interesting transformation.
Well, you could look at it like we're taking this little worm womb and making it into clothing. So we're taking the worms
So we're
out
all
and
worms.
everything, except do they actually do it while the worms are still inside, or do they wait for them to hatch?
I don't know.
I think it's after they leave. I don't think they destroy the process.
Oh, how kind.
Well, it's another. So we've got kind of two big themes that kind of come up with this idea of chrysalis, right? Because we've got the yin yang idea that there's this constant transformation from one thing to the other. And here we definitely have a transformation that's happening in terms of the worm transforming into, and I believe, again, in this case, it's more of a moth. But then it's also, to pick up on Dane's concept of this being a womb, there's a good parallel with the idea of when we're talking about Wu and Yu, this transformation or this transition from no form to form and back again. This is a symbol of that, kind of like that gateway, right? Of that, what they would see as kind of this miraculous generative process that happens in nature. This would be another kind of core symbol of that, in the same way that they frequently will bring up the human womb or the feminine features in terms of that generative capacity. So there's some interesting things there in terms of this is like quite significant. And yet we take this thing and we turn it into something entirely different, right? There's that human activity that's now taking this really miraculous aspect of nature, this transformation that happens, and turning it into clothes that we then put an extreme high value on. So there's definitely a lot of really curious things that we can get into when we're thinking through, or just going through kind of this thought meditation, right? This reflection on an aspect of reality and what we do with it, and how that could have some different ways for us to think about how we live. And you guys brought up a lot of great points, including, recognizing that transformative process, but also I think you brought up the idea of creating kind of a mess, Taylor, with this idea that, we kind of spin ourselves into getting ourselves into trouble, or Dwayne was talking about getting all tied up. And then also this idea of perception that Dane brought up, how it transforms in our brains as well, and trying to get back to that undifferentiated view. I like that a lot. Just lots of different things that can come about from something that seems very simple. Why would we take time and just look at and think about a cocoon? But really, there's actually a lot there if we take the time to do it. So in a similar way,
we could take time to look at a lot of things a little more deeper in our lives. I think we're all trying to move so fast these days.
For sure. Yeah. And so the second part they talked about was uncarved wood. And this is interesting. I just wanted to add a little bit of background about trees and wood. So there's an unfortunate history of translating that concept into English as uncarved block. But as soon as you say block, you're talking about something that's already been carved. And really what they're getting at is wood that hasn't been manipulated. So it could either be like a branch that has fallen on the ground, or it could be a whole tree, right? But what's interesting is the Taoists will often remark about gnarled trees. And the reason that they fascinate them is that they live for a long time. Any thoughts on why a gnarled tree would live longer in classical China than a tree that grows more straight?
First thought is like it adapts to its environment. Like you think about those trees where there's something in the way and they just grow around it anyway.
Well, that's a very interesting. Yeah.
Not as useful for lumber.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah,
And,
they're not as nice. They don't get cut down.
right. So
That's a good point.
they frequently
I mean, just look at it. Try making a chair out of that,
Right, yeah.
Yes. Sorry, Dwayne, were you going to say something?
No, because then I just thought, I didn't even think of the human angle. I just thought because they twist and turn and all kinds of stuff, so they don't just go straight up, so they could withstand more, of nature's stresses. But yeah, the human angle totally makes it more apparent.
Yeah. And
actually, I just thought of a connection to these crabs in Japan that I learned about, read about a long time ago. But basically, they have this kind of design on their back that, in some individuals of the species, it kind of looks like a human face. And there's this mythology about how they're
Ooh.
like they had like the spirits of reincarnated warriors or something. So like the ones that looked more like the human faces wouldn't get like harvested by humans for eating or whatever. So eventually the species adapted to where like they all kind of look like human faces. It's sort of
That's
an
so
example
cool.
of human selection influencing, like human selective process influencing natural selection in a way.
yeah.
And
That
creepy.
Yeah. So with the tree then, there's various stories that'll pop up in different Taoist discussions about people complaining about trees that weren't good for being able to make lumber. And the Taoists will come back and say, what are you talking about? You've got this magnificent shade tree that you can sit under, or the fact that the tree is enjoying a long life because it didn't happen to meet the criteria that humans were looking for to use it for a different purpose in terms of this, lumber or something along those lines. So with that kind of, just as a historical context for some of the common Taoist reflections, let's again take a moment to just kind of reflect on this idea of uncarved wood, and what are they trying to help us to understand about this in terms of this chapter, getting to, again, this question about who we are in terms of, the center of the universe question, as well as the idea of our desires. And so what can we observe? What does the process of observing this uncarved wood help us to understand in that regard? So again, we'll take some time to kind of reflect on this. If you're watching the video, if you wanted to go through the same exercise, you can go ahead and pause the video now. All right. Anybody have some thoughts they'd like to share?
Well, in parallel to the idea of original perception, or original awareness before we shape it, I think there's a parallel idea of the original being before we are shaped by conditioning. Kind of like the nature that we have as a baby, but also like if we have natural hunger signals and we have conditioned hunger signals. Like if you are in tune with your natural hunger signals, then you eat the appropriate amounts and types of foods at the appropriate times. Whereas if you're conditioned by hunger signals, you see a billboard for a Big Mac and you crave a Big Mac, or you see a commercial for Coke and you suddenly crave Coke. Those are like sort of conditioned signals and impulses and things that we may think are part of us or natural, but actually are overlying our instinctive, natural instinct, the same way that animals know what to eat and what not to eat. And some even know, this mushroom is toxic unless you also eat this other leaf at the same time, and then it will cancel out the toxic benefits. The animals instinctively have that kind of knowledge, and so do we, I think, underneath our cultural conditioning.
And so make the connection for me with how the observation of the uncarved wood ties into that thought.
Well, the uncarved wood is an analogy for the original, like we are part of nature, just like the tree is, and we have a natural shape before culture and family and conditioning comes in and shaves us to fit a particular role in society.
Gotcha. Okay, so the uncarved is before we've been adulterated by culture. That culture.
Adulterated is a good term for it. Yeah, the original nature. It's an analogy. I see it as an analogy for the original unconditioned nature, or even the there's sort of our primary emotions. Like if somebody we love dies, we feel sad. And then there are other emotions, like if we see somebody who's more successful than us, then we compare ourselves negatively. That's more of a conditioned thing, and the emotions that arise out of that are more a matter of conditioning, as opposed to emotions that are kind of primary to our nature.
Gotcha. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking along the same lines. Like you look at wood, uncarved wood, and you think, oh, well, this could be a spoon. It could be I don't know, a tool of some sort. It could be this, it could be that. But you can also just appreciate it for what it is and how it got there, and not try to impress anything upon it and just let it be. I think along the same lines of what Dane was saying, like we can impress upon ourselves, oh, I need to be productive. I need to, get to these points in life at these certain times. Like I need to be at this point in my career and then I need to keep going, and you're constantly chasing things. But I think it's important to also take time to just appreciate yourself for what you are, and go a little bit easier on yourself, and not always try to turn yourself into a spoon or a chair or what other people expect you to be.
Mm, I like it.
Since you mentioned goals, Taylor, I also see the same analogies applies to goals as like there are goals that we're sort of conditioned to want, that family and society, other people tell us we should want.
Right.
There are goals that we actually want intrinsically. And I just actually listened to an episode of Huberman Lab podcast that it talked
I love
about
that.
how when we were more intrinsically motivated to pursue goals that we choose for ourselves than goals that are set for us externally by others.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I love Andrew Huberman. It's very
Yep.
interesting.
Agreed. Dwayne, did you have any thoughts?
What I've focused on here was kind of like growth and resiliency. So two parts of it were like, well, if say you, like when I'm out hiking, I see some pretty gnarly oaks out there, and some of them are growing up around rocks which were in their way, like giant boulders. Some have been almost split in half with lightning, but they still have leaves on them and are growing and are still alive. And then but say you cut down the tree and you turn it into a chair or something, that's when its growth is completely cut off, right? If that got hit by lightning, that's pretty much the end of the chair. So I think a lot of the allure and the, you know, the exercise is just to realize that growth is an important aspect, and that it's like almost unpredictable, and it has a pattern that is predictable but is also has variation within it. Like you couldn't tell which direction a gnarly tree is going to go unless you come back 30 years later and just observe it.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a really interesting point, is that the resilience of the tree to adapt, but that adaptability or the ability for something to continue to grow stops as soon as you make it into something. That's a very interesting concept. One that kind of came to mind that I don't know if it actually has as much to do with where they were going with this, but it's kind of an interesting thing, that if you were going to transform the wood into something, before you do that, the possibilities could be anything. But as soon as you do it, then it's fixed. Then it's just the one thing, which I don't think they were ultimately getting to, you know, the fact of transforming it into something else. But it is interesting how, kind of along the lines of what you were saying, Dwayne, about the unpredictableness, that you don't know what's going to happen with it. And if you interfere with it and try to make it into something, it stops. It's like all the creativity and the natural growth is just no longer possible.
That sounds a lot like the collapse of a quantum mechanical wave function, now that you mention it.
Yeah.
Infinite possibilities, and then it collapses to just one.
Yeah.
I'm actually really glad that you mentioned that, Dwayne, because I hadn't thought of it, but now that you mentioned it's kind of obvious, and particularly referring back to the passage about the supple and yielding is the companion of life, and the stiff and unyielding is the companion of death. As soon as you when the tree is uncarved, it's still alive and supple, and when it's carved, it's it's stiff and dead.
Yeah. That'll be in an upcoming chapter, but that's one of my favorite lines for sure within the Daodejing. So yeah, there's definitely something that gets lost as soon as we try to conform the tree to some expectation, right? And I love the way Dane was talking about, you know, our cultural impositions being kind of equivalent to this idea of cutting away at the wood and forming it into a particular shape. And, you know, how Dwayne brought up the differences that happen in terms of the failure to be able to continue to adapt, right? So if we think about that culturally, you know, we get kind of put into a mode of thinking that kind of controls our brain. It puts the blinders on, and now we can only see things kind of one way. We've lost that resilience. We've lost that adaptability that would happen if we were just kind of in more of our natural state and growing. And, you know, same thing with Taylor was talking about, all the different ways that this thing could be kind of manipulated, but why not just let it be what it is? And, you know, there's another thing that's kind of interesting. In preparation for the new series that's coming out on Netflix, I was rereading The Three Body Problem, which is a fascinating sci-fi book. But it starts off actually during the Cultural Revolution in China. And it has this one scene where there's this worker who is tasked with cutting down all these trees, and some of them have been there for like 300 years or something like that. And this guy asked him, he's like, don't you feel anything about chopping down this tree that's been alive for 300 years and in 10 minutes you just destroyed it? And the guy's like, no.
Oh my God, of course he was.
Like, why should I? You know, I was asked to do it. I did my job. And, you know, it brings up kind of another thing here that maybe tying into what Taylor was saying, that when we lose touch with the oneness of everything, that we're not connected, and we start to see everything as individuated, as separate things that can be used as commodities or pieces, we lose that sensitivity, right? The tree just becomes something to use, not something that has kind of value in itself and value in the sense that we're all connected through the same system, right? Yeah. So there's again a lot.
You're talking along very similar lines to one of my favorite thinkers, Daniel Schmachtenberger, who talks about how when you have like a tree in an ecosystem, as a part of an ecosystem, it's providing an uncountable number of benefits for an uncountable number of beings. It provides shelter for animals and food for bugs and the microbes living on its roots, and birds and everything. And it's providing oxygen and cleaning the air and holding the topsoil in place and doing all of these, providing all these benefits for all different actors. But then when you cut it down and make it into 2x4s, it provides one specific benefit for one specific or very narrow group. So you take all these benefits to all these beings and collapse them down to a small number of benefits for a small number of beings. And that's why the built world is fragile, whereas the natural world is anti-fragile.
Yeah. Getting back to that idea of resilience again. Yeah. So a lot of fascinating observations we can have when we take the time and just reflect on, again, different aspects of our natural world. One of the key aspects that the Taoists are asking us to do. And if we take this then and go to the conclusion. So if these two exercises of reflecting on the raw silk and reflecting on the uncarved wood, the suggestion is that this is going to help us with two different aspects. Now here they're again talking about reducing your sense of self. And I think what we're picking up here is a bit of, from the translator's perspective, a bit of later kind of almost like Buddhist thinking, that it doesn't really seem to be part of at least the classical Taoist period, where there's not an idea that we're actually going to be able to rid ourselves of an idea of self, right? We can't help the fact that we're located where we're located, where the locus of our senses is where I am. And we might have different ideas about what self is, but not that we're going to get rid of the idea of self. It's, I think, more of a concern in the Taoist perspective of how do we get the centeredness out of self as opposed to getting rid of self? And how do we think about the distinction of self versus other differently? And then also the same thing with desires. This is notoriously, excuse me, translated in various ways within the Tao Te Ching that I think is really contrary to where they were going with it. It is impossible to be without desire. Even not wanting to have desires is a desire. Everything that humans do, any type of action you take is because there's some kind of desire involved. The question is not whether we desire or not. The only way you're not going to desire is if you're dead. So the question is, what are we going to desire and why? How do we desire rightly? And by rightly, of course, I've put a value judgment on it, but the Taoists are making a case that there is a way to align our actions and our behaviors along the patterns that exist in the world that we observe, that they would refer to as Tao. And that as we get in harmony with and alignment with that, we will be better off because we won't be hitting our head against the wall trying to, go against the natural way of things. So desires, I think here, the idea of lesson could be looking at it in terms of things like not being greedy and that kind of thing. But I don't think we should look at it in terms of not having desire as much as it is shaping our desires or having more of an intention behind the types of desires that we developed based off of our different types of worldviews. So I'm curious how you guys see these concerns that they're wanting to get to here at the end with the two exercises that we just went through with the raw silk and the uncarved wood, how those help to flow into these two goals that are being held up as kind of like the real point of this chapter.
Would you mind reiterating that question, Jim?
Sure. So we were just going through the exercise of reflecting on raw silk and reflecting on uncarved wood. And the implication in this chapter is that in going through that practice, it's going to help us with these two final points here that they're saying is really the goal that we're trying to get at with this, the point of this chapter in the Daodejing, in terms of having, it's going to modify our sense of self in some way, and it's going to modify our desires in some way. How do you see the flow from those exercises to these points?
To me, this comes across as reduce, if you insert false, reduce your false sense of self, lessen your false desires, and tune into your true self and your true desires more. It doesn't mean cast away all desires and sense of self uniformly, but discard the false and in favor of the true, because there is a true innate self and true innate desires. We desire the things that are healthful for us and that keep us alive. And we're also conditioned to desire stuff that's not good for us, false desires. And we have a true innate sense of who we are that has a sense of purpose in the world, and we have false conditioned beliefs about who we are that are sort of externally imposed. So I just insert reduce the false sense of self and lessen your false desires in favor of the true ones.
I like it. So any thoughts on how reflecting on raw silk and uncarved wood helps us to do that?
Well, just recognizing the distinction, recognizing that some desires are true desires and some are sort of conditioned desires, and being aware of the distinction, you can distinguish between, is this a true desire and feeling, or is it a false desire? Is this is this something that my true self really wants, or is this a conditioned belief or goal? Just recognizing that there is a difference allows you to discern between the two and choose one over the other.
Anybody else have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, kind of along the same lines. Like if we kind of forget about turning ourselves into a chair or a spoon, like the wood, or shirts and pillowcases like the silk, and just get back to our baseline and simplicity, it gives potential to give rise to more clarity and letting go of those desires to meet those goals that are imparted on you, and having certain possessions, and those things can be very distracting.
Mm-hmm.
But you can kind of connect to what they're calling the way easier with the clarity you get by focusing on that, like not emptiness, but just more of the baseline of yourself.
Yeah. I just realized we're kind of at our time, so I'm going to speak just kind of quickly here. A couple of thoughts I just wanted to impart. So when we're thinking about the desires, when we think about, what is happening with the human ingenuity of transforming that raw silk into something else, the garment, or transforming the tree, this living, adaptable thing, into a fixed, unbending, unyielding, non-living thing, that those are desires that are creating those transformations. And so it's helping us to become aware of desires that maybe are having more of a negative impact on our environment, because we're being kind of shaped culturally. Different things are driving our desires, as was brought up, to want us to utilize these things in a way that's recognizing them more as individuated things that can just become resources instead of an interconnected whole. And that when we see more of that interconnected whole, it definitely has an impact on how we think of self, and especially with the Taoist perspective of rising above merely that humanistic concern of just human relations, but taking it even above that to understand what is the relationship with everything that we are just one part of, helps us to move ourselves out of that center of the universe, but see ourselves as an aspect of this more interconnected context that we find ourselves in. So there's a lot of really interesting ways that we can go through these processes and end up in these places. Love the observations that everybody had today. Sorry we're having to kind of wrap it up kind of quickly here, but I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. And if you're watching this video and you'd like to be a part of our online discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and look forward to seeing everybody next time.